How many of you have ever gone on an extensive hike, or just enjoy hiking, or have enjoyed hiking in the past? Some of you? Okay. Some of you I know have hiked in your cars and gone from place to place. Others have ridden bikes, and some of the more brave have taken to trails and looked at sites from just the standpoint of just walking and looking around and seeing things at a slower pace. And one person that I know in our church that has been a pretty avid hiker for a long time is Bob Martin. And I don't know if you've ever talked to Bob Martin about hiking, but I know that in the last 10 years since I've been here, he's hiked in a number of places. And one of the things that he told me as he was preparing for a hike in California was that you have to have yourself conditioned so that you can do the hike and not get midway through and end up collapsing. And so he would talk about taking his backpack and loading it down and then spending weeks in advance just wearing it and wearing things like ankle weights and anything that can just build up your stamina for that journey. And he shared with me that if you didn't do that, you would probably not make it. And he mentioned a time when he went to California and hiked, I believe it's the trail that basically runs north and south up through California. And one of the persons that came with him didn't go through that process of preparing. And it became obvious very quickly that he was struggling and quite possibly couldn't make it. And I remember him talking about sharing the load and all of that so that they could get through it. And it was really kind of eye-opening for me to think all that has to go into preparing. And what I find so intriguing about it is I very much see the Christian life not as a static, I'm saved, I've got my fire insurance paid up, so I know I'm not going to hell, and now I'm just going to ride it out until I die, and then we'll be good. But rather it is baptism into waters of basically death that call you up into newness of life, so that like Jesus, you go out and you begin the journey. As I mentioned earlier, my son Christian is hiking through national parks this summer. And it's interesting because when we were in South Africa, and he was born over there, and we call him our little African American, and he said, I love plants, and I always, I became increasingly aware that his love is profound, but I never saw him doing what he's doing right now, and that is on this big adventure. But when we named him after Christian in Pilgrim's Progress. If you've ever read that book, it's a story of a journey from basically our earthly place to the heavenly city. And it's cool to see this play out in his life. It's sometimes reality is more cool than any story you'd see on TV. Excuse me. So as that's playing out, I'm just reminded of the Christian that is in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and the things that he had to do along the way to make the journey a successful one. And there were all of these different sins that are described in that journey that would weigh him down or would perhaps hinder his forward progress. And I thought I would just take that classic catalog of the 7 deadly sins which are mentioned in that book and look at them through the eyes of a person who's taking a journey, and also through the Sermon on the Mount. So if that's a lot to swallow, hopefully we can digest it slowly and in a good way together. So if you have if you have your message outline in front of you, what I'd like to do first of all is look at some of the scriptures that are mentioned. And I want to look at the first sin of the 7 that we will encounter. And it's highlighted in Matthew 6, and it's described in further detail in the following verses. But essentially, it opens up by saying, and this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, by the way, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. And essentially what Jesus was taking on was this sense that, oh, there's my water right there. I'm already a little parched from the journey. So I probably wouldn't make it very far, I would imagine. Jesus is looking at, of all people, religious people, and they're parading around with a high degree of pride, saying, look at me, look at all the things that I am doing to have great status with God. And Jesus would just roll his eyes when he would see that, because he knew that it wasn't so much about performance as it was the condition of our heart and perhaps the things in our heart that weren't right that needed to be dealt with. And he said, look at these guys. They're making a big production out of their lives, but in reality, pride is written all over it. And there are a few other sins that he mentions in the Gospels directed towards them that we won't go into, but in each case, they're deadly. He went so far as to say, if your righteousness does not exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisee, then you cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. And that raised a lot of eyebrows with people, because they're thinking, well, if they're not going to make it, then how in the world can I make it? And that really proved to be a great question. And Jesus gave on the Sermon on the Mount some indicators that anyone can follow and anyone can have that tell whether or not your heart is right with God. And we call them the Beatitudes. And the first one in Matthew 5, as he opens up the Beatitudes, so if we back up in the sermon a little bit, he said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And that's pretty radically different from the people that in Jesus' time that were saying, look, I'm religious, and if you want to be close to God, you got to act like me. But you probably never will be, so I'm going to pride myself in the display that I have of my righteousness. And Jesus is saying, this is so misguided. You have all the elements of religion, but your heart is just way off. And he said you have to have the right attitude going into it. Now, one thing that I do know about hiking is you do have to be prepared. And as I underscored that a minute ago, I experienced that firsthand and to some degree financially in sending my son off to the great unknown. But there are things that he had to take with him. And a couple of them I have here with me that he forgot. He forgot his backpack. And so I thought, well, I'll just use it then. And I'll just set that right here, and it's pretty heavy actually. And then there's of course the sleeping bag and tent and pillow and things that you need for that. And inside that backpack is a lot of weight. Matter of fact, there's about 7 objects in that backpack that are pretty heavy. And I wrote down their names. One is, and I keep it in my shirt pocket, pride, envy, anger, gluttony, sloth, lust, and greed. And if I keep these things in my backpack for too long, there's a good chance that I'm not going to make it to the end of the journey, and it's going to kill me. So I'm going to lighten my load a little bit and just begin with what this says. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who have basically nothing as they come before God, except the very breath that he has even given them themselves. And I'm going to just go into a little detail about the meaning of that in a moment, but I want to contrast it with another scripture that we find in Matthew as well, in the Sermon on the Mount. It says, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." And Christian who is taking the journey in the book, The Pilgrim's Progress, is displaying the light of God in his life increasingly as he gets rid of the weights that he's carrying, and people see it more and more and more. And I'd like for us, as we go through this together this summer, to look at what God is doing in our lives so that we can take any excess baggage that we have and lighten our load somewhat and be able to follow our Lord in ways that perhaps we couldn't before because we were too loaded down. So for the next few minutes, we're going to look at the message outline. But prior to doing that, I want to show you one more image of a hiking route. I don't know if you know what this is or not, but some of you have heard of it. It's a little over 2,000 miles long. It's a trail, and it's called the Appalachian Trail. Some of you maybe have even walked on parts of it. Maybe you've just seen the Robert Redford movie, A Walk in the Woods. If you've seen that, it's a story about the author Bill Bryson going on the Appalachian Trail, and the book is absolutely hilarious. And it whet my appetite to take that trip someday. But then I decided, you know what? I don't do that anymore. I just send my kids, and I'll just live through them. So I convinced them, I said, when you get wealthy, take 6 months off, because that's how long it takes, and do that. So I don't know if they're going to follow that directive or not, but anyhow, that is an example of a trail that about 300 people a year make. And a lot of people attempt it, and they give up. And some people actually go on it, and they get lost because they go off trail a little bit and they lose their bearings, and some of them aren't discovered until years later, and they're no longer alive. So there are hazards that are in place, and in anything that is worthwhile, that is forward moving, there's the possibility that you'll make it to the end, and there's a possibility that you won't. And in our case, we're making a spiritual journey from one place to another. And Jesus wanted us, he was our greatest cheerleader so that we could make it to the finish line of our journey. And I just want to say before we begin, there are actually 2 traveling options that we need to consider, and I'm offering 3 basically, but you have to pick 2. And here's the first option. The first option is the weight and the benefit of traveling alone, and this is where pride actually is such a deadly thing in the process. Pride says a lot of things about what we think is important and who we think is the most important. And for the religious leaders, they were basically saying, look at us, we're important. And Jesus said, yeah, and it kind of ends with you. You're not a signpost to God at all. It's just all about you. And there's a form of pride that is like that. There's another form of pride that doesn't really say so much about it's all about me, but rather it just says, I like to go it alone. And this is the weight that you carry if you have that kind of pride. Like, I want to do it like Frank Sinatra says in that great song, my way. I want to do it my way. And so the weight that you have is you have to carry it all. Your backpack has to contain all of the essentials for sustaining your life for the duration of the trip. So it's a heavy load. And as you do it alone, because pride is really about you and your choice, and about not letting others tell you what to do or influence you. It is about basically being very strong-willed and self-sufficient. Now, there's nothing wrong with being strong-willed, and there's nothing wrong with sufficiency. But when you shut other people out, and even God himself, then it's basically God saying, if you want to do it alone, go right ahead. However, the chance of death increases significantly. There was a lady that was in the news last month, and she was hiking the Appalachian Trail. And her name was Geraldine, and I couldn't pronounce her last name, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Geraldine was 66 years old, and she went on a hike on the Appalachian Trail with another lady hiker companion. And her companion had health issues that came up roughly halfway through the journey. And she told Geraldine, I can no longer continue on. I have to go and I have to get medical care. Now, Geraldine wasn't a bad person, but she was very strong-willed and very determined. But her husband said the only downside of Geraldine continuing on by herself is she has a very poor sense of direction. And ill-equipped for navigation, she carried on. And what occurred was she was basically hiking on the trail, and she decided she would go off trail a little bit and look around. And when she did, she lost her bearings, and she just kept wandering and wandering and wandering. And she survived for about a month. And each day she would write things in her journal, just describing her state of mind and the things that were weighing on her. And then, eventually it became clear in her journal that her health and her vitality were at an end. And, she just expressed well wishes and love to her family if they ever found her. And she ended up perishing just a few miles off the trail, because once you get off the trail and you lose your sense of where you're at, it's game over. It's scary stuff. And the thing about doing it alone is you put yourself in a much more vulnerable position to the elements, to the dangers, to possibilities that would not be there had you included other people on the journey. And so what the bottom line is here, you can choose to go the journey and go it alone. And there are a lot of people who, when they become followers of Jesus, they say, I want to do it alone. I don't really want other people involved in this. It's a private, personal faith. And anytime we do our faith in private and we do it alone, we lose out on so much care, prayer, love, encouragement, provision, resourcing that comes from having people around us. And really the church by design, as difficult as it is sometimes, because let's be honest, we're not all easy to get along with at all times. We have our moments, and myself included. My wife and I were actually on a team of interns in South Africa before we went as missionaries, and we had to spend 8 weeks with these other people that we knew and liked. But there were some times where we were so closely confined that we were not real happy that we did know them, and we certainly didn't like them, and they didn't like us. But at the end, obviously we bonded and have lifelong friendships as a result of it. But we did need each other, and that really goes to the second option that's in play here. And that is, of course, the benefit is you can do it your way if you do it alone and you do it with pride. But you can consider another option, and that is travel with others. And two things can actually happen when you travel with others. If you're in groups of people and you are moving forward, and by that I mean a group walking down a trail like the Appalachian Trail, or a people that assemble every week in a church or in small groups, and they move forward together on life's journey. It works well. You can travel light, if you have humility, it's just this sense that I'm not burdened by concerns that are sideways energy or drama that preoccupies everybody. With humility, it is I'm putting other people first. And we can travel light as a church or as a small group or as a team of companions when everyone is thinking about other people in terms of their well-being. Or we can be heavy with pride. And like any group, if there's a person who says, it's all about me, or if there's a person who says it's all about what I want, then it's like if you've got more than 2 people, 2 to 10 or 50 or 300 or whatever, who all say we want to do it my way, it just doesn't seem to work very well at all. It seems to be very heavy and you can't go very far. So when you travel with others, you have to actually pick one or the other with the group. So it's sort of like a sub-circle. You know, I don't want the pride option. I don't want number 1, but I like number 2. And if I have number 2, I know that I've got to do it with humility or I have to do it with my will in charge. And as a pastor, I do know this: humility always wins the day more than just forcing my will all the time. And that applies to each of us. So there are benefits when humility is in play. Everyone watches out for each other, and everyone values their need for each other and their strength for the journey. I heard an interesting story yesterday by an individual who lived in Columbus, and his name was Al Nash, and he was an immigrant. And when he came here, he was making clothing, and one of the vendors that he was working with to supply the clothing decided that he wanted to give up his business, and he had a bunch of basically sweatshop people working for him. And it wasn't the best of conditions. And Al said, even before he met the people that he was going to work with, he said, you know what? I want to run this business with the golden rule. I want to treat my employees as they would treat me. And so he met with the people, and some people were only making like $4 a week. And he just said, you know what? You're only making 4. I'm going to give you 12. And he would like triple the number of the wage for each person that was in their employ. And all the people were like, holy cow, who is this guy? He really cares about us. And as a result, his goodwill towards them, his desire for them to be blessed like he had been blessed, just began to pay off. And it was sort of like this self-reinforcing virtuous cycle of everyone working together. And he wasn't even sure how he was going to pay these people. He just knew, I'm going to try to do this because my conscience says I have to treat my employees well. And so he made that attempt, and he wasn't sure how the books were going to pan out. And when he asked at the end of a certain business cycle his accountant what the revenues were, he said, you're going to be shocked to hear this, but they're 3 times what they were. And he said, well, how could that be? And he went and talked to the employees. And one of the employees said, when you came in and you said you wanted to treat us like you would want to be treated, and then you in that same spirit increased our wage, we decided we were going to increase our output. And as a result, he just continued going to bat for him over and over and over. And they were going to bat for him back over and over and over. And it wasn't a formula as much as it was in his heart. He wanted to see good things happen to the people that were in his employ. And there were other business people who were beginning to take note at his business as it evolved and began to get a greater share of the market. And they would ask him, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm just treating my people as I would want to be treated. And so they'd write down a formula, and they'd go back to their business, and they would try it, but it wouldn't work. And he basically said, if you're not exercising the brother rule, and they're like, huh? What do you mean the brother rule? And he said, if you're not truly treating this person like your brother, then no formula in the world is going to make it happen. It has to come from your heart, not just some business thing that is flavor of the month that you're telling your employees to do. And I believe that what he did is just essentially what Jesus was saying, that if we have this attitude of humility towards each other, then when we're working together, we're walking together, and when we're watching out for each other and the needs of each other and the strengths for the journey, then you find out that it is going to be very easy to reach your destination. But you can forget all of that if you want to, and you can take your pride and say, I want to do it my way. I want to carry the weight of my pride around. I want to prioritize my own agenda. And then people start to get hurt. And my son Christian was telling me that even out of the gate, we have 6 people on the team that are getting ready to go to on this big trip. And already there's different ideas about how this should transpire. And he said, Dad, this thing's really going off the rails. And I said, well, have you guys sit down and talked about expectations that you have for one another, expectations that you have for the trip, agreement on who will be responsible and accountable for things? He said, no, we haven't really dealt with that. And I said, well, why don't you sit down and talk about that, get everybody aligned on what it is that you're wanting to do, get everybody to agree with it, have a professor oversee it, and then have everybody sign off on it. And he went and he did that, and he said, that helped everything to get in order. And it took some of the chaos out because everybody was just sort of directing what should happen. And in that team conversation, they began to agree on what was important and what wasn't, and how they could get to the end of their destination with everything being understood. And a lot of times, it's just a matter of communication. When that doesn't occur, people get hurt. And they can get hurt emotionally. They can even get hurt on the trail physically. A person will say, I'm going to go on this leg of the trail. I'm going to kind of explore some uncharted territory. And everyone else might say no, but this person says, yeah, I think that's what I want to do. Only to find that they don't return in a few hours, and then they have to go and find them, and then all of a sudden, chaos begins to reign. And anytime you're separated from the group, it seems like your vulnerabilities and your chances of getting hurt are much greater. And it's no different for us. And when Jesus was giving the Sermon on the Mount, he wasn't talking about an individualized religion that we experience just as our own private journey. He was addressing a group of people and how this group of people would actually live and exist together as citizens of God's kingdom. And he was prioritizing, in his case, the role that humility needed to play. And there's nothing harder for us than to say, I was wrong, or to say, I don't want to necessarily, I'm willing to not do it my way. And I'm willing to process this and do it the way that wisdom of maybe the group in this case would prevail. And it's just interesting. Jesus sees all that in you and I. And when he gives this sermon, he sees that when you prioritize yourself and your pride, things go south. But when you work together in a spirit that is defined by the things that he says in the Beatitudes, things really start to hum along. And one thing that we conclude is there is a third option, and that is Jesus wants to underscore as he opens up this Sermon on the Mount, and he describes the most important thing that we have to do. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit. And there's been a lot of debate about what that means. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? And there are a variety of commentators that I've read over the years who try to give meaning to that. It could be poor people. It could be spiritually a poor person. But one commentator wrote something that I think really made a lot of sense. Because the word spirit in the Greek is pneuma, which is where we get the word pneumatic and air. And it is that life-giving spirit that God breathed into the first humans when he gave them life, and his spirit animated them. And as a new creation, God's spirit is also breathed into us, and his presence empowers us and enlivens us. And the one thing that I know about the imagery that Jesus is using here is, have you ever looked at something that was a big undertaking, and before you began, you just kind of stared at it, and then you took a deep breath? Have you ever just instinctively done that? Like, okay, I'm ready. And that's essentially what he's driving at. It's like you need to take in the breath of God's presence. You need to acknowledge right at the beginning, I do not have what it takes, but God does. And I'm going to trust him at every turn for everything that I need on the road ahead. And our faith is really about trust, isn't it? The very beginning steps that we make to follow Jesus are premised on trust and obey. Abraham was told, go to the land I'll show you, and you'll have a kid. And he's like, I'm not sure about either one of those, but I'll trust you. And ever since then, God's been calling you and I to trust him for the journey. And he says basically, you're carrying a weight in your backpack, and it's a heavy one. And if you keep carrying it, and it is probably the greatest weight of all, it is your pride. And if you keep carrying that weight around, and you don't let it go, and you don't trust me, and you say, I'm gonna lighten my load, I'm gonna empty my load, and I'm gonna take this heavy weight of pride, and I'm just gonna throw it off to the side. And I'm just gonna acknowledge that, yeah, I was saying I could do it all my way, but I can't, and so I'm dependent on you. I need your life-giving spirit for each breath, for each step, for each day, for each month and year, and for the rest of my life. Give me this day my daily bread and everything else that I need. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And Jesus just starts the Sermon on the Mount almost as if saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. And if you were a good Hebrew, you would have saw the significance of how he said that and that word that he used. It's a pretty cool word, pneumatikos. It's the word for spirit. It is the word that just goes on to describe every part of this experience as God's Spirit leads us. Now, there's another word here called blessed. And it's the Greek word makarios, which you don't need to know that. But a lot of people say, well, what does it mean to be blessed? Some people, like Robert Schuller, would say, happy are the people that are poor in spirit. But it's not really about your state of mind as much as the openness that you are to have the heart of God. Did you catch that? It's just the willingness to have the heart of God. And if you seek the heart of God, you begin to experience the joy of God. And all of a sudden, that despair and hopelessness that you had, when you go to the Lord and you say, I'm worried about the future, I'm worried about my health, I'm worried about my kids, I'm worried about my job, I'm worried about my finances, and you go to God and you say, God, I am poor at every level. And God said, I want to bless you with my life-giving presence. And I want to help you with each of these areas because You recognize your dependence on me. And I just want you to know my joy. And I want that joy to replace the burden of all those things that weigh you down so heavily. And that's one thing that I've experienced as a believer, because I have all of those worries and they try to creep back in. And I just keep saying, you know what? I can only do what I can do. But the most important thing that I can do is trust God in these areas, because I know that He not only is my shepherd and my guide for the journey, He's in charge of the environment that I live in. Jesus richly knew that. And He said to those that were paying attention, you'll be blessed if you trust. And you start with God. There's just one more insight. I've got to throw this in. I can't help it. But the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph. And I know you could probably care less about this nerd stuff, but the word Aleph, whenever you say it, you don't say it. It's there, but it's like, that's how my Hebrew professor, I said, how do you pronounce Aleph? He said, and I said, huh? He said, it's like, and I said, it's like taking in a breath, isn't it? He said, yeah, it's exactly like that. It has this sense of, and then you go on with the rest of the alphabet. And it's just one more way that God shows us. We have to sort of breathe Him in, and then that's when we begin. But if we say, I don't have room for you inside of here, God, God will say, that's okay. If you want to do it alone, go right ahead. But I'm just offering myself into your world because I know the burdens that you carry. And I want to help you with those burdens. And I want to surround you with church people that can help you with those burdens. And I want you to travel as light as possible, but also recognize that as you travel, I'll be with you, and the people that I surround you with will be with you. And so you travel as if every breath depends on God and the people that He's put into your life. And this is the last thing I like about this, the benefit. I don't really see a downside at all in traveling with God, because when I travel as a person poor in spirit, dependent on God at every turn, that's the best way to prepare for the journey. With God, there just is no downside. He's God, and He helps us through everything. Your problems may seem insurmountable in this moment, but God says, whatever your problem is, I'm bigger than that. And then God blesses us richly, as I mentioned. I use a Spanish word there, bienaventurado. I'm still working on my Spanish lessons from Shirley. But that actually means good adventure. And one scholar who was Spanish, who translated the Beatitudes, said, bienaventurado are the poor in spirit. Bienaventurado. And he went on to say that. And it basically has this image of a person who is on an adventure, but knows that this adventure is going to end in success, and it's going to end in a cheering crowd. And he knows in his heart that as he's taking this adventure, there's going to be joy along the way. And instead of the weight of the burden, is it over, it's going to be a light load that is, despite the adversity of the circumstances, it's going to be filled at its very central part with the joy of God and with the promise of knowing that there is a group of people celebrating at the end of this good adventure. And the commentator that I read said, what Jesus spoke, He spoke at first in Aramaic, which is a form of Hebrew. And there is no English word that captures it very well. The word blessed is pretty weak. But bienaventurado catches it very well. I don't know Spanish that well, but I like the way he described it. And I like the spirit behind it. And I just like the life and the vitality and the health that comes from being blessed by God. And I wonder, are you blessed by God? Or are you still living under the curse, which is the weight of the fall It is the life lived under the ruler of this world. It is the burden of having to do it alone. It is the fear that haunts us every day, thinking that I'm vulnerable. And all of those heavy things that are indicative of the curse that happened a long time ago. There's good news. Jesus died for our sins. He rose from the grave. And he is now Savior and Lord. And his whole design is to bring us into a journey where we experience his blessing, and we are constantly surveying the landscape to bring others alongside with us as we go. And maybe today God is calling you to join us on this journey. And maybe God is saying there's some weights that we need to throw off. And the first one may just be your pride. It's not easy for us to humble ourselves and say, I need a Savior. But when you do, life is a lot easier on the road ahead.